Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's IPW lecture with the title, And the Walls Remain the Same, Local Conflict in Northern Ireland in Light of Brexit, the Irish Border Issue, and Disruptive Power Sharing. This IPW lecture is part of the International Lecture Series of the Institute of Political Science, and it is very nice that this lecture is actually taking place, as most IPW lectures that were organized got cancelled, unfortunately due to the current situation. Today we will hear about Bert Preiss' recently published book with the title Conflict at the Interface, Local Community Divisions and Hegemonic Forces in Northern Ireland, in which he gives insights into developments and ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland after the Belfast Peace Agreement in 1998, as well as further developments due to Brexit. And Neil and Jarman will give insider view of the current situation, and then afterwards together they will discuss also recent developments of the local conflict related to the corona crisis. So first I want to welcome Bert Preiss. I guess some of you listening right now have met him. He's a lecturer and in peace and conflict studies and international politics at the University of Vienna, as well as the University of Graz. And also I want to give a warm welcome to Neil Jarman, who is in Belfast right now. He has many years of expertise in the topic discussed today and is a renowned scholar in this field. He is head of policy and research at Peace Direct, which is a London-based international peace-building charity. And previously, he has been the director of the Institute for Conflict Research in Belfast for many years. And he's honorary professor of practice at Queen's University in Belfast. And now, before starting with the interesting input, just a short organizational remark. You can put the questions in the chat. So you can find the chat, probably most of you know, you can find the chat icon, the lower part of the Zoom window. You can post your questions already during the talk, and I will collect all the questions. And then at the end of the inputs, I will direct them to Bert and Neil. And also, please, I don't know if you can actually change it, but keep your microphones muted, please. So now, Bernd, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anna. Good evening and welcome everybody to this virtual session, also from my side. I'm very happy to talk to you today, and I would also like to thank Neil Jarman for joining the discussion and for providing insight on the Northern Ireland situation, and Anna Preiser, thank you for the overall moderation of the talk. One more thing, I mean, since due to technical, not problems, but I would say limitations, I will have to take care of the guest room. So sometimes there might be a brief interruption, beep, but I will take care of all of you that you can attend this lecture. Let's start. As time is precious and scarce, especially in this online setting, I will immediately delve into the topic. And maybe just one more remark. As Neil already pointed out to me in our preparatory chat, academics usually have too much to talk about. I hope that this time this does not apply to me and that I do not exceed my time. So Anna, please keep an eye on the time. So to start with, I hope you all can see my presentation. And first of all, this would be the agenda, but I move on to the first slide, which would mean I would start actually from the local. First of all, providing you second-hand experience, so to say, on my research in Northern Ireland, which is primarily based on empirical findings. And then I would move on to the overall, give you a brief overview on the overall situation, on the important developments in history of the Northern Ireland conflict, and then moving on to the local conflict in Belfast, where I would like to present you my empirical findings. At the end, I mean, after talking about the impact of Brexit, the Irish border issue, and Northern Ireland's power sharing impasse, I will come to a really brief conclusion and future outlook, and then I would like to pass on to Neil Jarman to give you an overview, his assessment actually of the current situation in Northern Ireland. So these are the three quotes I mentioned before, which are selected quotes from O'Leary's work from 2016, which draw on 300 to 400 interviews with local people in Northern Ireland, asking them what this interface, this peace wall, but I come to that, means to them. So first of all, for the first quote is, the interface is emblematic of contested origins. The interface is the continual occlusion of the day after question. And the interface is a published policy that specify a government goal by 2023. So when I came to Northern Ireland in 2004, but then also in 2009, it did not change this picture, there was a wall. So this wall actually, which is shown here, shows the first peace wall built in September 1969, which runs along Cooper Way, separating Protestant Loyalist Shankill from Catholic Republican Falls in West Belfast. It is a 5 meter high, multi-level corrugated iron barrier that stretches for almost 1 kilometer in length. But this was not all, actually. In fact, there were numerous peace walls spread almost all across Belfast. So what you see here is actually from the top to the bottom. You see the first picture and the first row to the left. You see an interface between Ardoyne, Catholic Ardoyne, and Protestant Glenbryn at the Alliance Avenue. Then you see further peace lines, interfaces. Moving on, these are all in North Belfast, and I leave the last picture to the right out for the minute. And to the bottom, on the bottom, you see an interface, which I showed before. This is in West Belfast, this is on Central Belfast, and this would be in East Belfast. This enclave is called Cluan Place, a Loyalist stronghold. So say were only 15 or 16, with only 15 or 16 residents, which are what you see here in the interface, which is separated from Republican short strand. The last picture here to the right that I would draw your attention to is actually a strange interface, so to say. It's even in death they are kept apart, one could say. So this is at Milton Cemetery a cemetery in West Belfast, where upon the request of the Catholic Church, the dead bodies of Protestants and Catholics were separately buried. But they were not buried there actually, because Catholics were then buried in another burial ground, which was quite in the neighborhood. So moving on actually to the next picture, I also made other initial observations, such as murals. So actually showing, symbolizing actually division. So you see at the top, you see Republican, the first row here you see Republican murals. To the left, this is a Republican hero, a hero of the IRA, which is a volunteer, which is said Bobby Sands, who was also a member of parliament, who became famous for leading a hunger strike in 1980 that led then to his death and to the death of 12 other volunteers. Then you see here the commemoration of the Easter Rising, and on the two pictures at the bottom, you see actually the impression given by that you see in Loyalist neighborhoods. Here, this is actually the picture how they see the summer of '69. In '69, the recent conflict broke out, famously called Troubles. And here you see actually in Cluan Place, this is this enclave I mentioned before in East Belfast, where they actually provide a list of the suffering of the casualties actually that were incurred by by Republican paramilitaries. Then moving on here to the top, actually these three pictures here are from Derry or Londonderry, as the town is called, depending on the second biggest city in Northern Ireland, depending on whether it's by Republicans, or by Catholics or by Protestants, so to say. And here you see actually a British soldier smashing violently enforcing entry to a house. And here you see you are entering now Free Derry, and Free Derry, after the when the conflict started, was actually a self-proclaimed republic by Catholic residents in Derry, which actually existed up to it was a no-go area, so to say. It existed until 1972, and then it was violently crushed by the British Army. And then at the bottom here, this one is in the Loyalist area in Derry, Londonderry, which actually shows you quite in a nasty way, I would say, in a brutal way, how they were actually willing, committed to defend up to their deaths the union with Great Britain. So we determine what is said here is actually at the top. We determine the guilty. We decide the punishment. And then at the bottom there is another commemoration, also in the Loyalist working class area mural. So what I also saw was paramilitary memorial gardens to the left by the also voluntary force, a Loyalist paramilitary force during the conflict. And here, this is an IRA memorial, Irish Republican Army memorial in West Belfast. This is in East Belfast. Then I was spectator and observed several parades, which actually many of them proceeded with no big trouble, but actually I got the sense of actually of explosive mood that was there. So for instance, here this picture here shows actually the 12th of July annual celebrations. This is the 12th of July parade by the Orange Order. And here, there you see actually the aftermath of it. And here you see actually, yeah, you see that there is a fire burning, and what you see here actually is bonfires. So you see actually bonfires is actually the tradition on inaugurating this 12th of July celebrations, where they actually put several nationalist symbols, or they put slogans, nationalist slogans. So you see INLAR, Irish National Liberation Army, Social Democratic and Labour Party, and so forth. You see Bert Preiss, who were at that time minister, Sinn Féin minister, Republican minister, and then they burn actually this pile and have a celebration. And here at the bottom you see actually how kids are Loyalist kids in a working class area in East Belfast, how they are trained actually to build such a pile. Then moving on, actually, what I also discovered in my stay in Belfast and in Northern Ireland was that there were deprived and desolate areas around, that the areas around Belfast interfaces were deprived and desolate. And here you see actually some pictures of it. These at the top, they are from North Belfast, actually from Kilnadoin. Here you see actually a picture of a youth club, which thankfully has been modernized, so it doesn't look like that anymore. And then to the bottom, you see actually also in North Belfast, this is a Loyalist stronghold and this one is actually again Cluan Place, and here you see actually the space, and this is maybe quite noticeable, that this is actually an interface separating the Shankill in West Belfast from a Republican, a Catholic area in central Belfast. And here you see that there is a lot of space actually, and there are some things actually lying on the ground. So this space is actually significant in this sense that actually I discovered that at many interfaces that on the Protestant side of the interface, there is space, and on the Catholic side, the houses are built almost very, very close to the interface. So this also indicates a problem of housing, of space. So moving on actually to the next set of pictures, what I discovered also was by contrast, the affluence, developments, and also these embodiments of power in other parts of Belfast. So this would be in central Belfast. You see, this looks like any other nice, any other city center, a nice city center in a European in a European city. And then here, this is actually Stormont, a parliamentary building. And then at the bottom, and what you see is actually, and I also saw some more encouraging signs of initiatives for community development, tolerance, and reconciliation. This is a neighborhood center here, and I will come to that. This is actually a redeveloped interface, a redeveloped peace line, so to say, in West Belfast, in the outskirts of West Belfast. And this is actually a mural, and there are several such initiatives going on, and it's increasing to turn actually this violent nature of murals, this picturing of these pictures of division into a more friendly outlook, or to raise other issues with that. And here this would actually be a demand for housing, a demand for for education, for civil rights, and so forth. So moving on from that, so what were my initial inclusions actually? So the peace walls, murals, these peace walls, murals, memorial gardens, parades, bonfires, and flags that I just showed you are all manifesting and embodying divisions between the Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, and the Catholic, Nationalist, Republican communities. In fact, they are also emblematic of local intercommunal conflict and insecurity, and also they are the most tangible representations and paradigmatic images of intercommunal division and territorial segregation. And furthermore, they severely impair the living conditions of the local residents on both sides. So also in terms of getting to work, in terms of going to school, and health, provision of health services. And in particular, this was that they impede all this socio-economic development. And although offering protection from the other side, which is the main aim, actually the main purpose of these installations, they fuel intercommunal tension and violence. And moreover, the territorial concentrations of these peace walls and indicates a strikingly visible spatial gap also between rich and poor, because you only find it in working class areas, and especially in deprived working class areas. So it indicates this gap between rich and poor, between the deprived working class interface areas and the more affluent middle and upper class residential areas in Belfast, and likewise in Derry, Londonderry, and in Portadown. So the core question actually for me was at that time, as I dealt with it, I hope, extensively and conclusively in my book, how come that more than 2 decades after the Belfast Good Friday Peace Agreement in 1998, that there still exist local conflicts with intercommunal tensions, and that there are still recurring sporadic outbreaks of violence, a considerably high socioeconomic deprivation that still persists in Northern Ireland. And this despite all these considerable efforts towards building shared governance and improving relations and development by the community relations and development by the former parties to the conflict. And also efforts to local peace building and conflict transformation by community groups and activists on both sides. And also efforts by academics and experts to advance policy recommendations, and also considerable financial support provided by Great Britain, the Republic of Ireland, the European Union, also the United States. So how come? And well, what were my core claims and are my core claims and hypotheses that actually opposing ethno-national and socioeconomic class inequalities between the two communities, they not only have a significant impact on the generation and maintenance of local interface conflict in Northern Ireland, but there is also close interrelation, and they potentially reinforce one another. And the divided Unionist and Nationalist political elites, there seem to be a vested interest in power and hegemony over Northern Ireland, to achieve a hegemonic position, which affect and reinforce again the ethno-national and socio-economic class divisions between the communities. And these divisions and negative dynamics have become more apparent in the course of Brexit, the Irish border issue, and Northern Ireland's ongoing power sharing impasse. And what I just included today, well, the update, what's the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and its management by the two political parties in power at the moment from both sides. But that, again, I will pass on this question then to Neil Jarman, who will hopefully provide us more insights on that. So just very briefly, I mean, this is just a list and you can have a look at it by yourself. So it would be actually a list of key events in the history of Northern Ireland that occurred. I would start actually with this quote, Ireland is a small, which is quite telling actually, I think. Ireland is a small country where the greatest questions of politics, morality, and humanity are fought out. By Gustave de Beaumont, who visited Ireland very often, actually. And well, the early origins you could date them back to the 12th century with the English invasion of Ireland and the Strongbow and the Norman Knights, then the plantation and the Cromwell. Then you had actually all these divisive events, actually, where the Protestant settlers, the Protestant British settlers actually established their dominance, actually, their political dominance, the social dominance, and also the economic dominance in Ireland, but predominantly actually in Northern Ireland, which with industrialization became the economic center in the 19th century of the island of Ireland. In the more recent conflicts is, well then in 1920, what I can say is actually, just to summarize this, that the conflict, the violence in Northern Ireland has been driven by conflict over the political status of the region. The Protestant community, generally, they favor the continuing political union with the United Kingdom, and their hardliners also are known as loyalists, and the Catholic community generally favors close links with the Republic of Ireland, with some committed to a united Irish Republic. Hardline nationalists, as I said, as I mentioned already before, are known as Republicans. So coming to the crucial point, I think the crucial point for the modern origins of the conflict is the 1921 petition, the partition of Ireland in 1921, where the Anglo-Irish Treaty established self-government in Ireland and set this partition between Northern Ireland predominantly Protestant, remained part of the United Kingdom, whereas the Irish Republic, which it was later called the Irish Free State, as it was called before, achieved self-government. It became subsequently independent. The tensions between the Northern Ireland's Protestant Unionist majority and its maligned Nationalist Catholic minority, eventually they triggered violent conflict, especially with when the Civil Rights Campaign in the 1960s, which initially was was a cross-communal campaign, so to say. It attracted also a considerable number of Protestants. It started from the Catholic community, who wanted to make their demands heard for equality, for socio-economic and political equality, and fought against discrimination. But eventually, this was undermined actually by paramilitaries from both sides, actually, from the Republican side and from the Loyalist side, and culminated then in the outbreak of the armed conflict, euphemistically called Troubles, on the 14th of August 1969. And then after that, the Troubles reached actually a bloody climax then in 1972. Which is not included here, but this was the Bloody Sunday actually in Derry. And then in 1973, there was the first attempt actually made by both governments, by the British and Irish governments, to bring the two combating sides on the table and to reach an agreement and a shared power sharing executive. But this was actually then this did not work out due to protests and violent protests on the Loyalists, from the Loyalist working class. Another significant event was then the Irish hunger strikes by Republicans, which again led to another peak in violence. Then the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1986 reached between the British and Irish governments, who wanted also to, with this agreement, aimed also to bring this into a wider framework, actually, this conflict, and to to settle their strained relations, actually, to improve the strained Anglo-Irish relations. So all in all, the result of all this until then is deep ethno-national divisions, socioeconomic inequalities, and hegemonic power struggles between the ruling class of Protestant British settlers, who stem from this Ulster Scots, as they also emphasize, and subaltern Catholic Irish natives. Then, moving on, actually, as I said before, the causes of the Troubles. On the one hand, this Unionist hegemony after the island of Ireland was partitioned and Northern Ireland was established, the Ulster Unionist Party established a one-party system, a notarian rule, and as latecomers. And as actually this quote, actually, a Protestant government for a Protestant people stems from Sir James Craig, who was then Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1934. And this was quite symptomatic, actually, for this period and for the attitude by the Protestant Unionist one-party regime. The British state at that time treated Northern Ireland with benign neglect. Another reason that the Irish state was preoccupied with its own state building. And there was actually alleged social, economic, and political discrimination, also very real, by the Catholic nationalist community. And this militant Irish Republican counter-hegemonic campaign that started off within the civil rights movement to liberate Northern Ireland from British occupation. So the slogan actually breathes out. So the results of the Troubles, actually, when you see here you see the distribution of deaths among the conflicting groups. The death toll, as it is estimated, was over these 30 years of conflict, 1969 actually to 1998, but here the figures are until 2000, was amounted to over 3,600 people. So then the landmark actually that was achieved was on the 10th of April of 1998 with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. After a long political peace process starting in 1989, it was reached on the 10th of April in 1998. It was actually hailed as a role model for settling conflict in deeply divided societies. It includes an all-encompassing approach, actually, and aims to settle not only the divisions and the conflict in Northern Ireland, but also the strained relations between Great Britain and Ireland. And the logic behind it was actually how to achieve it was to get the radical sections of society, the political sections on board, and to make them on board of the political process, and by that to make them more moderate. And that was at the initial, at the beginning, there were secret informal talks held by the British government and also by the Irish government with paramilitaries, Republican side, and also then Loyalists were included. But this was only partially linked to the local community peace process, actually, which started off already also in the 80s, gained momentum, but again there was a lack of communication, and yeah, this was supposed to be actually a big problem. The result of these prolonged multi-party negotiations, which included all significant political parties, was actually then devolved government institutions based on constitutional power sharing and equal representation and treatment of both communities. So there was a parity of esteem, that both traditions, culturally defined, should be treated equally, had to be treated equally in public. An important component, and which proved to be a major bone of contention, actually, was this principle of majority consent on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. So there was this provision for a border referendum if there would be a majority likely that would wish change in the constitutional status. Then, as I said, there was also the aim at improving Anglo-Irish and also North-South relations. There were bodies established on that, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference and the North-South Ministerial Conference, and several independent bodies to reconcile the legacies of the conflict were equally established: the Equality Commission, the International Independent Commission on decommissioning, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the Parades Commission of Northern Ireland, and the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Also a consultative civic forum. Yet this was at the beginning already a late burner, so to say, and then eventually it proved to be unsuccessful, and it ended up in dispute between various civil society groups on both sides, and between the sections from trade and so forth. So it dissolved in 2002. So since then there is no civic forum anymore. And the post-agreement reconstruction and peace building, very briefly, was characterized, actually, I mean, initially there was already the Omagh bombing by the Real RA, a splinter group, a dissident group, aiming to destabilize the agreement. It killed 30 people in the town of Omagh. This devolution of power proved to be very problematic, and also after only prolonged negotiation on the agreement's provisions, especially on police reform and paramilitary decommissioning, which were the major issues. It was then eventually, there was a power sharing government installed, which were led by the more moderate parties, by the UUP and SDLP, but that proved to be inherently unstable. So British direct rule was recurrently reinstated. There was then, this led to, there was a political polarizations in the early 2000s, from the moderate to the more radical parties. So eventually, upon British and Irish governmental intervention, power sharing government was then reinstated in May 2007, and that proved to be stable, so to say, at least because it remained in office, this power sharing government led by the more radical parties on the political spectrum, by the DUP and Sinn Féin, until January 2017, but then it dissolved on a row on corruption and over corruption and the Irish language issue. So what was important in terms of the local peace process, there was regarding this community relations policy, the power-sharing governments who were then subsequently in office proved largely ineffective and dysfunctional. So, and this was all orchestrated by recurring episodes of sectarian community and sectarian violence between the communities, and also incited by the paramilitaries. So this, you can see here a funny picture. Actually, it was called both of them, they were called the Chuckle Brothers. So this is the First Minister Ian Paisley and Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness. Actually, Ian Paisley from the UP, Martin McGuinness from Sinn Féin, the former arch enemies and key protagonists of the conflict, smiling together, and they continued on like that in their period in office, and eventually also became friends until the death of Ian Paisley in 2012. Briefly, and I will exceed the time by 5 minutes. I hope that's okay. So briefly, moving on to the local intercommunal conflict. So how did this all mirrored, so to say, at the local level? And these actually, the following few slides, they draw on my extensive field research and field research stays at the Institute for Community, the Institute for Conflict Research, which at that time Neil Jarman was its director. And yeah, one could say the ground for the territorial segregation between the Protestant and Catholic working class communities was already prepared in early industrialization time in Belfast, so in the early 19th century. There were already severe, fierce sectarian riots between Protestants and Catholics. And then eventually the working class communities, the Catholic working class communities became concentrated in West and North Belfast, and the Protestant communities in East Belfast, but also in parts of North Belfast. So North Belfast became a patchwork of both, where communities from both sides lived very close together. And so North Belfast, one can see that also in terms of the death toll of and the effects, the violence during the Troubles, that in North Belfast there was a particularly high rate of deaths and injuries actually by during the Troubles. So you see here actually, this is on this. At the statistics of this table, you see actually a democratic shift in working class areas of North and West Belfast. So basically in North Belfast, the Catholic percentage increased between 2001 and 2011, there are the figures, but all the time it increased, and on the Protestant side it decreased. In West Belfast, the picture is actually a bit, I mean, it remains stable, but in East Belfast, you also see an increase of Catholics. Actually, and overall, you see an increase of the Catholic population in Belfast. And also in Northern Ireland, you could notice that. So this would be just very briefly, actually, showing the living situation in interface communities. So what you see is actually the darker the orange cells, actually, the higher is the segregation in the area. And you also see actually that there is a correlation when you see the multiple deprivation measure score. So you see a correlation. The areas who are most segregated, one could say, are also those who are most deprived, who are also those, well, this is just, for example, the unemployment figure, which is higher than in the rest of Belfast. And you also see here the lower levels of educational attainments and a higher rate of conflict-related deaths. This would be just to visualize actually division and well, the concentration of both communities and the segregation. The map is, although already from 1991, I think still shows to the large extent the concentration and segregation of the two communities. I couldn't find a more recent one. So what you see is actually here West Belfast. This is predominantly Catholic. North Belfast, you see here actually this patchwork of communities. You see here in East Belfast there are strongholds of this is a Protestant stronghold, but there are also now some pockets of Catholics actually here in East Belfast, and they are on the increase. This would be maybe another telling slide. So what you see here actually, there is a correlation between conflict-related deaths and interface areas and residential segregation. So nearly half of all, according to the study by Sherlow and Murda, nearly half of all conflict-related deaths within the Belfast urban area between 1969 and 2004 occurred with 300 meters distance of an interface between segregated Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods, and around 2/3 less than 500 meters away from the peace lines. So after what I mentioned before, after in the post-agreement period, the immediate post-agreement period was characterized by recurring intercommunal sectarian and paramilitary violence, which already was throughout the peace process before the agreement was reached. The drum cream marches by the Orange Order in Portadown, as an example, the Holy Cross School dispute in North Belfast, from 2001 to 2002, and more recently the flag protests over the waving of the flag on the Belfast City Hall between 2012 and 2016, which was a loyalist protest who protested violently with riots against actually not letting the flag fly the whole year over Belfast City Hall. These are just two more slides now on the interface community relations from my empirical evidence. So this is actually the first quote is, I think, quite indicative for the sense of fear and insecurity of the other side. It was with a resident a Catholic resident who declared himself also Republican in Ardoyne, who said, "You cannot walk freely wherever you want to. It is a deep-seated fear of being attacked." And he said that, pointing from his window to the street, and said, "Well, I never walked down that street, and that street led down to Loyalist Schenkel, and he was in his mid-50s. So he never went down there, although he could, but he could not because he did not feel safe." These peace walls are needed for protection. There's a huge sense of protection, although on the other hand, there are also more now actually who want them to be removed. A blame game for interface violence. There's a strong division on this constitutional status in the winner-loser dichotomy, and the community relation work was primarily engaged with containing interface violence. High segregation remains, high socioeconomic deprivation, and very limited economic redevelopment. And I should just show you two pictures maybe where of more positive examples actually where community development managed to move further actually. So you would see actually coming to this positive example of the Suffolk-Glenadone interface group. You see here actually, Glenadone is Catholic Nationalist Republican community in the outskirts of West Belfast. It is way larger than Suffolk, which is supposed to an enclave, so it is surrounded actually by Catholic communities. And in the 70s, it was a hotspot for violence. So an interface, you see it here actually, this is a picture from the 90s, was installed. And this was actually, there were shop fronts, but of course they were not used, and they were in a desolate state. And then eventually, so there was a lot of violence and a paramilitary stronghold also in the two communities. But then eventually, initiated by two women in the beginning of the 80s, a process by two community workers, a process for improving community relations and reconciliation. Peace building took off eventually, and in 1995 this interface group was formed, SLIG, and they managed eventually to get both communities on board and to redevelop the interface. You can see it here actually, it's now modern, it looks attractive, it is frequented by both sides actually. But there was then actually this major blow actually in 2009 to this cross-community development, when the primary school for Protestant children and concomitantly the mixed nursery had to shut down following a government's decision. And why? The school's application for they applied for integrated status because there were not enough Protestant pupils. So they applied for that, but it was rejected. It was actually turned down by the Minister for Education at that time from Sinn Féin, who rejected it exactly on this one criteria, that there were not enough children, that there were not enough pupils. All the other 8 criteria they met, but this one, that there had to be a certain number of children actually for the application, they could not meet. So it was turned down. And from then on, there was again reoccurring violence, and not at that intensity, but still. Second one would be actually the same. There were massive efforts actually made in the post-agreement period actually by a North Belfast interface network was formed, and eventually they managed to contain the violence and even reach out and to economic redevelopment. But there was when eventually people from both sides were prepared actually to remove peace walls, like the one you see here, Road Coast and Flag Street. They couldn't, because actually this was in Ardoyne actually. So they wanted the peace wall to be turned down, but they said we want road safety measures because they were concerned about their safety. And exactly the road service in the department actually turned that down, their application, on the grounds that there had been no accidents and no traffic. So, but how could there be traffic when there was the interface? You see, so they did not remove the peace wall, and then again the situation remained stalled. So, coming to the last slide, and the impact of Brexit, the Irish border issue, and Northern Ireland's power sharing impasse. The UK's Brexit process that started in June 2015 has caused over time, until eventually it was decided, there was a decision that Brexit will happen or happened, on the 31st of January 2020. This has caused a lot of confusion and controversy between the two communities. In particular, the divisions were about whether and how Brexit should happen, and if so, how the Irish border issue should be resolved. The possibility of a hard Brexit increased actually public concern about the economic and social consequences, and about especially also the constitutional future of Northern Ireland. So whether it would remain part of the United Kingdom, or if United Ireland was to emerge. This power sharing government in Northern Ireland has then been re-established on the 11th of January 2020, ending a period of staggering 1,092 days without a government. Then at the end, on the 31st of January, as you know, the UK left the EU, and after a transition period until the end of 2020, with or without a Brexit agreement. So this power sharing impasse and the political disputes between the two main parties in government, the DUP and Sinn Féin, has exacerbated the communal rift. And in light of these developments, I would say it seems that not only has the progress in community relations and peace building made in the aftermath of the agreement stalled now, but there may even be a danger that the overall peace process will be jeopardized. And how this actually then further developed, actually, I would like to ask Neil Jarman whether the Corona crisis management by the Northern Ireland power-sharing government has led maybe to more rapprochement, or maybe that there is more division now, or how would you assess actually the situation, and also assess the situation, Neil, in terms of local peace building and violence on the ground. Thank you. So Neil, I pass on to you. And I overtaxed my time limit. I am aware of that.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to add a few words. I'll try and keep it brief. And I would say that over the course of the last 25 years, the process of peace building has been erratic. At times there have been tensions, and at times there have been fairly substantial periods of peace. And I think over the last 10 years, there's been a steady increase in a reduction in tensions. So there's been a more stable situation on the ground, particularly in the last 5 years. Tensions over Preiser have been reduced. There's been limited amount of incidents of violence in and around interfaces. So there's generally a feeling that the situation has improved. The situation with the governments is more problematic. It's not generally been working particularly well. We've only had a government back in place in Northern Ireland for the last year or so. Brexit has caused tensions. It's caused tensions because it threatens to reintroduce hard controls around the border areas. But those haven't translated from a political debate into problems on the street. They have the potential to do that, but they haven't done so. They've highlighted the divisions between the political parties. Even when they're trying to work together, there are some fundamental differences, which, as some of your slides show, go back many, many centuries, long predating the recent armed conflict. So it's fundamental differences. But in spite of those fundamental differences, at times the opposing parties, the Unionists and Nationalists, are able to work together reasonably well. And the current handling of the COVID-19 virus crisis, I think, is probably an example where it started off in quite a difficult manner, with Nationalists wanting the Northern Ireland government to follow the Dublin lead, and the Unionists wanting them to follow the Westminster government lead, the British lead. But as it's developed, I think both sides have started to work reasonably well, because there is a common objective there, which is the virus doesn't discriminate between Protestants and Catholics. So in a sense, we've got a period of reasonable harmony at the moment. There are absolutely no tensions. A lot of the events and activities that would likely cause tensions in the summer, like the parades, have all been postponed this year, have all been cancelled this year. So it's the first year, I think, since 1942 or 1943 that there's not been a series of marches, and there aren't going to be a series of marches. So we're not anticipating community tensions, and it's actually the politicians seem to be working reasonably well to deal with the virus crisis. Having said that, it's dealing with it on the easy level. As soon as Brexit issues resurface, I would anticipate a return to very polarised positions, from Nationalists taking a pro-Irish position, a pro-European Union position, and Unionists taking a pro-British position. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, rather than go on and leave it for an opportunity if people want to ask questions and raise points from those listening
in. I mean, thank you, Neil, for this short and very informed picture you gave on the current situation. I might turn to Anna maybe and see if we have participants who have questions and address them.
During the talk, but maybe now some come up, and some of you have any questions to Neil and Bert. So now is also the time to ask. Okay, so far nothing comes up.
Well, then let's say I would have a question actually, Neil, to start with, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, I had a look actually at recent news on this management, on this Corona crisis management by the two parties. And one thing actually which came up very recently was, well, Arlene Foster is now somehow distancing herself from this policy by Boris Johnson actually, this stay alert guidance for coronavirus, where she says, well, it's not stay alert, but in Northern Ireland it should be stay at home guidance. And so how do you actually assess that, or do you think that there is actually some, because there were tensions over recent years between the DUP and actually the Tories. And so I just wonder if there are some tensions arising, or if this could have any effect, or if this is just.
I don't think there's any. I don't think there's particularly tensions evident between the DUP or the Northern Ireland Executive and the Westminster Executive. You have to remember that the United Kingdom's got 4 parliamentary bodies, 4 parliamentary regions, and although Westminster is the British Parliament overarching for all of the 4 regions, all the 4 countries, in the context of the coronavirus, it's very much functioning as focusing on what's going on in England, because the devolved governments in Scotland, in Wales and Northern Ireland have overall responsibility for a lot of issues such as health, which is relevant in this case. So they've tended to, by and large, they've tended to follow the British government, but in some cases they preceded it in terms of encouraging people to stay at home. And at the moment they are almost united in taking a more cautious approach than the Westminster government in trying to encourage people to start resuming normal lives. So in some senses, the Northern Ireland approach is more in line with what's happening in Wales and with Scotland rather than with England. But it's more on nuance and matters of timing rather than anything of more substance.
Okay. And are there any questions coming from the chat, or?
Actually, before there was, I remember now, there was there's a question about the pictures you showed in the beginning of the walls. Okay. And one, it says RFC, and the question was what this was meaning, like all those abbreviations.
It was here actually, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, UFF means Ulster Freedom Fighters. CAT means, at the moment I can remember, maybe Neil, you can help me out on that actually. But RFC, I'm not.
AAT is kill or takes.
Kill or takes, yeah, kill or takes.
Take is a slang term, a derogatory term for Catholic. I think their RFC there is probably, from the context, it's probably going to be Rangers Football Club. So it's football-related slogan, and Rangers are a strong Protestant team in Glasgow, in Scotland. So the association, these graffiti will have been signed on the all from the Protestant side and anti-Catholic in the sense graffiti. I think one thing's worth noting perhaps that although things like the murals and the bonfires and the parades have all had significance during the conflict and during the peace process, and have some senses been very much associated with that sort of period, the murals actually long predate the conflict. And the first mural in Belfast dating from 1908. The parades have been a feature of Northern Irish or Irish society from the end of the 18th century, and have frequently caused tensions between Protestants and Catholics. You know, similarly, bonfires and the interface barriers, the walls between the communities have, although they date, current cycle date from 1969, people have found photographic evidence of such barriers in intercommunal tensions in the early 1920s and again in the 1930s. So I think that highlights that, you know, there are tensions between the communities, or there have been tensions between communities for a long period of time. And they only occasionally surface as armed conflict and extreme violence. But also that the forms of symbolic displays like parades and murals and flags and all those kind of things are very deeply rooted in working class culture. And on one hand, they're all about displaying what our identity is, that we're about being a unionist or we're about being a nationalist. But they're also drawing boundaries so that if you're a nationalist, it's not only about celebrating one's own identity, but it's also often about contrasting and putting down the other identity. So although there are the political dimensions to the conflicts and the tensions within Northern Ireland, there's also an underlying symbolic and ritualized format in which such displays are a way of marking and demonstrating and reinforcing those sense of differences between the communities. And so you have those, even though we have a degree of relative peace now for the last 20 years, and Northern Ireland is much more akin to other European cities in terms of its levels of crime, its levels of violence. It does still depend on these fundamental differences in the political aspirations of the two communities, and which are constantly reinforced through symbolic and visual displays. Mm-hmm. So the two things can go together. You can have a relatively stable and relatively peaceful society, which is also relatively segregated and relatively antipathetic to each other. And the peace agreement in '98 was really about agreeing to change the way in which one pursued one's political objectives. They didn't reach a resolution. What they did was agreed that people wouldn't use guns and weapons to achieve their political aims, but would strive for them more through political debate. But it was a transitory agreement, and built into the agreement was that as long, or if at such time as a majority of people in Northern Ireland preferred to be part of the a united Ireland rather than a United Kingdom, that would be allowed to happen. So it's always been seen as a relatively transient place, and it reinforces this sense that the debate is about being part of Ireland or being part of Britain, rather than constructing a Northern Irish identity. Mm. Northern Ireland is a place where Irish people live and British people live, and some of them also use the term Northern Irish, but it still was very much a secondary identity.
Yeah, I mean, well, this would relate also to this inherent problem in this consociationalism. That's common, that can be seen so often in other places as well. That it actually reinforces ethnic blocs, ethnic national blocs on both sides, and that the middle ground actually, that it leaves not much space actually for an alternative politics to emerge, for some common ground, so to say. Also, I mean, although in Northern Ireland you had actually in recent years quite some progressive political parties appearing on the scene. I mean, before already you had the Alliance Party, that was already a traditional party, and then you had the Northern Ireland Women Coalition who actually were responsible, I would say, or were the driving force behind the equality agenda, or one of the driving forces in the agreement. And then you had People Before Profit, the Green Party. So yeah, this leads actually, then there's problem in this institutional arrangement, no?
I think what you made 2 points there. One is that consociational agreements are good in some ways in that they move politics away from conflict, but they create other hurdles further down the line, because they do reinforce a sense of ethnic identity and ethnic difference. And you see the same sort of problems in terms of struggling to establish coherent, sustainable and effective government in places like Bosnia or in places like Lebanon, where you have consociational agreements, or even in Belgium, where you haven't had the armed conflict. So that's one point, that the agreement reinforces that sense, or help to reinforce that sense of the bipolarity of the populations. And the other point, though, is the agreement is now 25 years or 22 years old. You've got a whole generation of young people who've grown up knowing peace as the norm, rather than knowing violence as the norm. You've got a whole generation who have got no direct experience of the conflict, and who see it as, in a bit in a way, from my generation, of seeing people talking about the Second World War. You know, it was something that your fathers were involved in rather than affect you. And a lot of them are turning away from the older traditional parties, still not in huge numbers, but you are seeing that some of that younger generation, particularly the more middle class ones, are perhaps embracing a more complex set of identities. That yes, there's some things they're British, some things they feel Irish, some things they feel Northern Irish. They don't particularly feel threatened by either of them. And you're also seeing them being willing to embrace other political ideals, whether that's the politics of the Greens, which is particularly picking up support within more unionist areas and middle-class unionist areas. And then or parties like People Before Profit, which are a left socialist, Trotskyist party, which is picking up support within working-class nationalist areas. And in both cases, I think those parties in the middle ground are or non-traditional unionist or nationalist parties, rather than middle ground perhaps, are building their base from people who are not wedded to the old nationalist and unionist divisions, but are willing to embrace other forms of political thinking. So I would think that the process of transition, you know, is something that's going to go on for a period of time. And I think when we were discussing peace process, I remember talking with people about the peace process 20 odd years ago here. You know, there wasn't really a clear sense of how long it would take for things to become a bit more normal. How long was the peace process going to require? And I think what we're seeing is, you know, it's a generational thing. You can get an immediate shift away from use of arms and to dialogue, to some level of dialogue, and then you get a second wave of it where for people for whom the questions are not relevant, the questions become different, their expectations are different, they start to look forward rather than look backwards. And I think as you move on into the next generation, as that first post-conflict generation becomes parents and their children, you'll see, the conflict will fade into the background. Part of the trouble is that in terms of political leadership, most of the political leaders are people who are impacted some way by the conflict. That younger generation have not become part of the political elite at this stage, and we've still got people who remember the conflict, who are victimised in some ways in the conflict, or who are actively involved in the conflict. And so that for the political elite, the conflict is still a very real issue, and they're still working through it. But for a lot of the younger generation, I would say that for people under 30, it's much less relevant. It's much less pertinent.
Some questions have come up, so I think I would just read them all to you. So because we also have kind of a time limit, because at 8 the lecture will end. So one question is, what impact Thatcher's policies had on issues related to Northern Ireland? Another question was if the pro-EU Irish unification movement will ever have a chance in Northern Ireland. Then the question with the peace program from 2014 to 2020 coming to an end this year, which provided billions of euros to fund peace initiatives since 1995. What do you anticipate with follow-up to this, considering the present Brexit situation? Do the British or Irish government have a contingency plan for this?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's take some of those rather than too many.
On Thatcher,
the first one was about Thatcher's policies, and because when Thatcher came into power in Britain, there was a conflict going on in Northern Ireland. A lot of the Thatcherite policies in terms of slimming down the state were not imposed in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland was always a bit protected from the elements of the Thatcherite policies. So we've still got a very large public sector. So it didn't have the same level of impact as it did in other parts of the UK. Although in terms of industrial development, economics, the conflict obviously had a negative impact on that. But also Northern Ireland was heavily based around heavy industry, shipbuilding and tobacco and engineering, which all collapsed in those recent periods. So Northern Ireland wasn't completely immune from the wider impact of Thatcherism and modern developments. In relation to, I think, the third question, which was around coming to an end of the peace monies, I think there's talk of still more money coming from the European Union because Ireland is still within the European Union. So I don't think it's coming to an end. It's been steadily decreasing for about the last 10 or 12 years. But I think we're anticipating there will be more money coming. But I think it also has less impact and there's less need for it as time goes on, as you might expect. Another question there was around Irish rejoining the European Union, or Northern Ireland rejoining the European Union in some way. And there was much higher support, there was a majority of support for remaining within the European Union, within Northern Ireland. And I think you might see that depending on how the Brexit negotiations play out, and depending on what happens when the formal rupture with the economic alignment happens, you might see, and depending on the impact it has on the Northern Irish economy, you may see a greater demand for support for rejoining the European Union in Northern Ireland. There is a funny situation which only just been reinforced, I think, yesterday by a European court decision, which says that anybody who was born in Northern Ireland, whether they're a British citizen or an Irish citizen, has protected status as a European citizen. So Northern Irish people will still have rights to work in Europe, even if European citizens don't have the right to work in Northern Ireland. So there's going to be a bit of time working out the kind of the odd situation in which Northern Ireland is placed within European position. It's a bit in and a bit out.
Maybe I would just like to add one thing about this Peace 4 program and about the prospects or after post-Brexit, actually. What 10 years ago already in my interviews with the Community Relation Council, at that time with the administration at Stormont, what they said actually is, or what community groups actually complained, or there was a complaint, was actually this huge competition actually, because the money was decreasing actually, that this peace money was decreasing, and that together with this lack of a community relation policy created actually a big fuss, so to say, a big insecurity, a big lack of direction, and this sense of having to compete for the money. So a lot of projects, at least that was a complaint, could not be realized, which would have made sense. Even at the Suffolk Glenadoon, when I talked with some people from the Suffolk Glenadoon group, they said, well, they had problems actually to get funding actually, and that was actually something I found out actually in my talks, yeah, at that time. But maybe that changed. Maybe there's not so much so much activity anymore, or so much. I honestly don't know how the North Belfast Interface Network now is actually, what they are now, which initiatives they have now, how active they are at the moment, because most of their focus was on containing violence, and at that time, 10 years ago, or also later when I had talked with somebody. There was one more question actually, I would come to that. No, the last one actually. How would the concession that allows Northern Ireland to remain aligned with EU's trade arrangements for 4 years impacts the future of the country? I mean, in some way you already answered the question, I think, Neil, but that was just coming in lately.
There's another comment there which somebody said about any sense of how the tensions manifest themselves in communities.
Yeah.
And what the barriers are like on the ground. I think you have to separate out the residential areas where people live, which is where all the barriers are, where the segregation is, and then the residential areas of the city. The main commercial areas of the city. And the barriers in Belfast are different from in some other cities where there's barriers, say like Nicosia, which is effectively divided in half. In Belfast, the city centre is open to all, is accessible to all. The barriers prevent people from moving between certain parts of the city, but you can circumvent barriers, you can go round them. Many of them have gates that are open part of the time of the day to allow people to move through and between. You do have a sense that people tend to see the barriers as marking out areas where they shouldn't go as part of their daily lives. So they focus their activities on their own residential areas and in the city centre and into the city centre. And the city centre is very much a shared space, not a segregated space. But I'll give you an example of this, which surprised me. I occasionally we'll do some tours around areas for various groups, and I did one last year that was organised by the City Council about this time last year, in fact, just about, pretty much the same this week last year. And I took a group, and it was just open to anybody who wanted to come along. And I took a group walking around the Shankill Road, some of the areas around the Shankill Road, and then crossing over into the Fords Road, so in a hardline Protestant area and a Unionist area, and then crossing over into a hardline Nationalist area. And I just walked people around between these two areas and talked about the murals and the barriers and the history and the politics and so forth. And as I got to the end of it, it was about 20 people I had with me there, and a mix of people. But when I got to the end of it, I found out that one of the women on the tour, and she was in her late 40s, I would say, she told one of the other people there that she lived on the Shankill Road area, in the Loyalist area on the Shankill Road. And this was the first time she'd ever been across the peace wall, across the barrier, onto the Falls Road. It's the first time in her life. And she said how nervous she was about to do it, but she felt because she was doing it in a group of people, she felt able to do it. And that really surprised me, that you had people who were, lived there all their lives, got into their early middle age, and were still being impacted by the barriers. Their routines were such that they didn't see the need to cross over onto the other side. So the barriers do have an impact. People do see them a lot of the time as providing a sense of reassurance, providing a sense of protection, and they do adapt their routines according to them. They know where the barriers are. And even when there aren't barriers, they know where the patterns of the segregated areas are. They know where Protestant areas begin and end and Catholic areas begin and end. And they will often adapt their behaviours accordingly. So these sectarian divisions do have an impact on how people live within the city.
We are 3 minutes past our schedule. So I would just like to share my screen for a last time. Just a quote to end the session. It's a French saying, and you know it, Neil, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Yeah? The more it changes, the more it remains the same thing. That would be actually just my personal conclusion in terms of the prospects for conflict transformation, which you said, Neil, would take time. It's a generational thing, actually. Young people feel completely different, feel much different than the older ones who are still, pretty much thinking in terms of conflict, of division. So maybe this does not hold. I would hope that for Northern Ireland, this would not apply anymore in the future. This would be my personal conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much for your inputs and the questions also. I hope you also found it interesting as I did. And yeah, all the best. I think we will close the session. And I wish you all a very nice weekend.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Anna. Thank you all, and all to you. All the best to you all. Stay healthy.
Bye.
Stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.